The Vethkai had ruled the galaxy for 11,000 years, and all that time, no species had ever challenged their dominance. They stood 9 feet tall, with bodies covered in natural armor that could stop plasma fire, and their minds worked on 4 separate tracks at once, which meant they could think 4 different thoughts simultaneously. Every species in the known galaxy feared them, and every species that had tried to oppose them had been crushed without mercy. The Galactic Council was really just a puppet government that the Vethkai controlled from the shadows, and everyone knew it, but nobody dared to speak against them. High Arbiter Kethvorin was the supreme leader of the Vethkai, and he had held that position for 300 years, because his species lived for nearly 1,000 years. He sat upon his throne made from the bones of defeated enemies and watched the holographic display that showed him the latest news from across the galaxy. A new species had been discovered. Kethvorin leaned forward with mild curiosity as he studied the images of these creatures called humans. They were small and soft, with no natural armor and no claws and no fangs worth mentioning. Their homeworld was a nightmare of a planet filled with predators and diseases and natural disasters that should have killed them off millions of years ago. Yet somehow they had survived, and somehow they had built starships, and somehow they had found their way into council space. Fascinating, Kethvorin muttered to himself as he watched footage of human ships entering the border territories. His advisors had already prepared a report on these newcomers, and the conclusions were unanimous: humans were weak and primitive and posed no threat whatsoever to the established order. Their bodies were fragile, and their lifespans were laughably short, with most of them dying before they reached 100 years old. They had no psychic abilities and no natural weapons, and their technology was at least 2 centuries behind the galactic standard. The only noteworthy thing about them was their persistence in surviving on a planet that seemed determined to kill them. Kethvorin dismissed them from his thoughts and went back to more important matters. 3 months later, a human delegation arrived at the council spire, requesting an audience with the High Arbiter. Kethvorin agreed to meet them mostly out of boredom, because nothing interesting had happened in the galaxy for several decades. The council chamber was designed to intimidate visitors with its massive pillars and towering ceilings and the bones of failed challengers displayed along the walls. Representatives from 100 different species filled the observation galleries because everyone wanted to see what these strange new creatures looked like. Kethvorin watched from his elevated throne as the human delegation entered through the main gates. There were 5 of them, led by a woman with dark hair and calm eyes who walked with the confidence of someone who had nothing to fear. This amused Kethvorin because she had everything to fear. "I am Commander Sarah Chun," the woman announced in a voice that carried clearly through the chamber, "and I speak for the United Earth government." Kethvorin studied her for a long moment before responding. "You are small," he observed, "and your species is young, and your technology is primitive. So tell me, Commander Chun, why should the Galactic Council care about humanity at all?" Sarah Chun did not flinch at the insult, and she did not bow her head in submission, like so many others had done before her. "We wish to join the Galactic Council as full members," she said simply. Laughter erupted from the observation galleries as dozens of species found this request hilarious. The Vethkai delegates exchanged amused glances because no primitive species had ever made such a bold demand. Kethvorin raised one of his 4 arms to silence the crowd. "You wish to join the council," he repeated slowly, "and do you understand what that requires?" "Enlighten me," Sarah Chun replied. "There is only one path to council membership for a species that has not been conquered," Kethvorin explained, "and it is called the trial of supremacy." He stood from his throne and descended the steps until he towered over the human delegation. "The trial consists of 3 challenges," he continued, "and they are single combat between champions, and a fleet engagement between armadas, and a strategic conquest simulation between civilizations." Sarah Chun looked up at him without any trace of fear in her eyes. "And if we win all 3 challenges?" she asked. "Then you will be granted full membership and all the rights that come with it," Kathvoran answered. "But no species has ever defeated the Vethkai in the trial, and most do not survive the attempt." The other members of the human delegation shifted uncomfortably, but Sarah Chun remained perfectly still. "You should also know," Kathvoran added with a cruel smile, "that we will select the champions, and we will choose the battlefield conditions, and we will design the simulation parameters." "That seems fair," Sarah Chun said, and her voice carried no sarcasm at all. Kathvoran blinked in surprise, because that was not the response he had expected. "You understand that we will choose Vethkai champions," he pressed, "and that our warriors have never been defeated in single combat." "I understand. And you understand that our fleet tactics are mathematically perfect and have crushed every enemy we have ever faced." "I understand. And you understand that our strategic minds operate on 4 cognitive tracks, which gives us an insurmountable advantage in long-term planning." "I understand all of this," Sarah Chun said calmly. "And humanity accepts the trial of supremacy." The chamber fell absolutely silent. No species had accepted the full trial in over 3,000 years, because everyone knew it was suicide. Kathvoran studied the human woman for a long moment, trying to understand what he was seeing. Was this courage or stupidity or something else entirely? "You have 1 month to prepare your champions," he finally announced, "and may your gods have mercy on you, because we will not." Sarah Chun smiled, and it was the smile of someone who knew a secret that nobody else understood. "Thank you for the opportunity, High Arbiter," she said, "and I look forward to proving humanity's worth." She turned and led her delegation out of the chamber, while whispers erupted from every corner. Kathvoran returned to his throne with a strange feeling in his chest that he had not experienced in centuries. It took him a moment to recognize it as uncertainty. He pushed the feeling aside because there was nothing to worry about. Humanity was weak and primitive, and they would be crushed, just like every other species that had dared to challenge the Vethkai. The trial would begin in 1 month, and it would end with humanity learning their place in the galaxy. Kathvoran was certain of this. He had never been more wrong about anything in his entire life. The arena had been carved from the heart of an ancient asteroid over 10,000 years ago, and its walls were stained with the blood of countless defeated challengers. Billions of beings across the galaxy watched through holographic feeds as the first trial was about to begin. The single combat challenge was considered the most straightforward of the 3 tests, because it simply required 1 champion to defeat another in hand-to-hand fighting. The Vethkai had selected their greatest warrior to face the human champion. His name was Dexoral, and he had killed over 200 opponents in arena combat without ever suffering a serious wound. He stood 8 feet tall with 4 muscular arms that ended in claws sharp enough to tear through starship hull plating. His natural armor was thick and ridged and had been tested against plasma fire and energy blades and everything in between. Vexoral entered the arena to thunderous applause from the Vethkai spectators who had traveled from across the galaxy to witness the slaughter. He raised his 4 arms in triumph, even though the fight had not yet begun, because in his mind, the outcome was already decided. Then the human champion entered and the applause turned to confused murmuring. Sergeant Major James Okonkwo was a large man by human standards, standing 6 feet and 2 inches tall, with broad shoulders and powerful muscles. But compared to the massive Vethkai warrior, he looked like a child standing next to a giant. He wore simple combat fatigues instead of armor and carried only a standard military knife, instead of the exotic weapons that other species usually brought to these fights. Dexoral made a grinding sound that passed for laughter among his people. "This is the best your species has to offer," he called out mockingly, "and I was hoping for at least some small challenge." James did not respond to the taunt. and instead he simply rolled his shoulders and settled into a relaxed fighting stance. "I will try to make your death quick," Dexaral announced, "because I am not without mercy for lesser creatures." "That is kind of you," James replied in a calm voice. "High Arbiter." Kefvorn watched from the royal observation deck with growing anticipation because he always enjoyed watching Dexaral work. The signal was given, and Dexaral exploded into motion with speed that seemed impossible for a creature of his size. His forearms struck simultaneously from 4 different angles in a killing pattern that had ended over 100 opponents. The claws sliced through the air where the human had been standing, but James was no longer there. He had moved before the attack even began, and now he stood 3 feet to the left watching the HFY warrior with calm eyes. Dexaral spun and attacked again with even greater speed and ferocity. His claws whistled through empty air as James simply stepped around the assault. "Stand still and fight." Dexaral roared in frustration. "I'm fighting," James replied, "and you are simply not hitting me." The HFY warrior launched a furious combination of strikes that would have torn any normal opponent into pieces. James flowed around each attack like water flowing around stones in a river. He was not faster than Dexaral, because no human could match HFY's speed, but he seemed to know where each attack was going before it arrived, and he was simply never in the place where the claws landed. The crowd grew silent as they watched something they had never seen before. A HFY warrior was being made to look foolish by a creature half his size. "What trickery is this?" Dexaral demanded as he paused to catch his breath. "And what kind of creature are you?" James remained perfectly calm, and his breathing was still slow and steady. "We are persistence predators," he explained, "and on our world we used to hunt by chasing animals until they collapsed from exhaustion." Dexaral snarled and attacked again with renewed fury. "We could not outrun our prey in a sprint," James continued as he dodged another killing blow, "but we could follow them for days and weeks until their bodies simply gave out." An hour passed and Dexaral was beginning to show signs of fatigue. His movements had slowed by a fraction, and his breathing had become labored. James had not attacked once, and he had not stopped moving for even a second. "Our ancestors survived by reading the body language of predators," James said as he sidestepped another strike, "and we learned to see attacks coming before they were launched, because those who could not do this were eaten." Dexaral's honor was beginning to crack from the strain of his own attacks. His 4 hearts were pounding so hard that he could hear them in his ears. 2 hours into the combat, the HFY champion was struggling to stay on his feet. James had not broken a sweat. "You are strong and fast," James acknowledged, "but strength and speed mean nothing if you cannot land a blow, and you cannot outlast an opponent who refuses to tire." Dexaral made one final desperate lunge with all 4 arms extended. James stepped inside the attack and placed his hand gently on the warrior's chest. "On Earth, we have a saying," he said quietly, "and it goes like this. It is not the size of the dog in the fight, but the size of the fight in the dog." Dexaral collapsed to his knees as his body finally gave out from exhaustion. His 4 hearts were racing toward failure, and his muscles had nothing left to give. He looked up at the human who had defeated him without throwing a single punch. "What are you?" he whispered. "We are survivors," James answered, "and we have been surviving against impossible odds for 40,000 years." He extended his hand to the fallen warrior. "There is no shame in losing to an opponent who simply refuses to give up." Dexaral stared at the offered hand for a long moment before accepting it. James helped the massive warrior to his feet and supported him as they walked out of the arena together. The crowd was completely silent because they had just witnessed something that should have been impossible. A HFY champion had been defeated without his opponent ever striking a blow. High Arbiter Kefvorn sat frozen on his throne as he tried to process what had just happened. The humans had won the first trial. and they had done it in a way that made a mockery of everything the Vethkai believed about combat. Commander Sarah Chun stood in the human observation area with a small smile on her face. She had known what would happen because she understood something that the Vethkai did not. Humanity had spent millions of years being hunted by everything on Earth, and they had survived not by being the strongest or the fastest, but by being the most stubborn creatures in existence. The first trial was complete, and the humans had proven that raw power meant nothing against an opponent who simply refused to die. 2 more trials remained, and the galaxy was finally beginning to understand that they had underestimated humanity in the worst possible way. The second trial was the fleet engagement, and High Arbiter Keth Voran was confident that this would be where humanity finally fell. Single combat was primitive and unpredictable, but space warfare was a science that the Vethkai had perfected over 11,000 years. Their tactics were mathematically optimal, and their formations had been proven in 10,000 battles across the galaxy. No species had ever defeated a Vethkai fleet in a fair engagement, and this simulation would be completely fair, with both sides receiving identical resources and starting positions. The simulation chamber was a massive spherical room where holographic fleets could be commanded in real time. Every ship movement and every weapon discharge was calculated with perfect accuracy, so there was no luck involved at all. Admiral Yevtorok commanded the Vethkai fleet, and he was considered the greatest tactical mind his species had produced in 5 centuries. His 4 cognitive tracks allowed him to monitor every aspect of a battle simultaneously while planning 3 moves ahead. He had never lost a fleet engagement in simulation or reality. Admiral Helena Vasquez commanded the human fleet, and she was a 70-year-old woman who had spent her entire life studying warfare. She had served in various Earth navies for 40 years before humanity reached the stars, and she had studied every major conflict in human history. Her officers surrounded her in the command center, and they moved with quiet efficiency as they prepared for the battle. The simulation began with both fleets positioned on opposite sides of a neutral star system. Each side had exactly 100 warships of various classes, and the goal was simple: destroy the enemy fleet completely. Admiral Yevtorok immediately deployed his ships into the Crucible Array, which was the standard Vethkai battle formation. It was a mathematically perfect distribution of firepower that maximized damage output while minimizing exposure to enemy weapons. Every ship knew exactly where to be and exactly when to fire, and the coordination was flawless. Then Admiral Vasquez gave her first order, and the Vethkai observers were confused by what they saw. The human fleet scattered ships broke away in every direction, forming small clusters of 3 to 5 vessels that moved in seemingly random patterns. There was no formation and no apparent coordination and no logical structure to their movements whatsoever. They panic already, Yevtorok announced with satisfaction, and this will be over quickly. He ordered his fleet to advance on the largest cluster of human ships, intending to destroy them before they could regroup. But when his ships closed to firing range, the human cluster simply split apart and vanished into the asteroid field nearby. Meanwhile, 3 other human clusters had circled around and were now attacking his rear elements. Yevtorok redirected a portion of his fleet to deal with this new threat, but by the time they arrived, the human ships had already moved on. This pattern repeated over and over for the next several hours. The Vethkai fleet maintained perfect formation and responded to every threat with mathematical precision. The human fleet moved like a swarm of insects, with each small group operating independently and making decisions without waiting for central command. When Yevtorok concentrated his forces in one area, the humans would attack from 3 other directions. When he spread his fleet out to cover more space, the humans would concentrate and destroy isolated ships before fading away. This makes no sense, Yevtorok muttered as he watched another 3 ships destroyed by an attack that came from nowhere. And how can they coordinate without a command structure? Admiral Vasquez heard this comment through the open communication channel, and she decided to explain, "We call it mission command." She said calmly, "And it means we give our people objectives and trust them to figure out how to achieve them." She watched her display as another human cluster executed a perfect ambush without any orders from her. "Every captain in my fleet knows the goal is to destroy your ships." She continued, "And they do not need me to tell them how to do it, because they can see the battlefield and make their own decisions." Yevtorik's 4 cognitive tracks were struggling to process this information. "That is impossible," he insisted, "because no species can coordinate complex maneuvers without central direction, and the cognitive load alone would be overwhelming. Humans have been doing it for centuries." Admiral Vasquez replied, "And we did it at Trafalgar and Midway and 100 other battles where central command was impossible." She smiled as another cluster of her ships emerged from behind the moon and destroyed a Vethkai cruiser before vanishing again. "The thing about perfect tactics is that they are predictable," she explained. "And I know exactly what you will do in every situation because your responses are mathematically optimal." She leaned forward in her chair as her fleet continued to tear the Vethkai formation apart. "But you cannot predict what we will do because even we do not know what we will do until the moment we do it." The battle lasted 6 more hours, and by the end, the Vethkai fleet had been completely destroyed. Admiral Yevtorek sat in stunned silence as the final simulation scores were displayed. He had lost every single ship, while the humans had only lost 37 of their original 100. How is this possible? He whispered. Admiral Vasquez appeared on his screen with a look of genuine respect. "You are brilliant tactical minds," she acknowledged, "and your formations are genuinely perfect for fighting enemies who follow predictable patterns." She stood from her chair and stretched muscles that had grown stiff from hours of concentration. "But perfection is a cage, and it limits your options to only those responses that are mathematically optimal." She looked directly into the camera with eyes that had seen 40 years of human warfare. "We do not seek perfection because we know that the universe is chaotic and unpredictable, and the only way to survive is to be more chaotic and unpredictable than everything else." High Arbiter Kethvaran watched from his observation chamber with growing horror. The humans had now won 2 of the 3 trials, and they had done it by fighting in ways that should not have worked. His advisors were scrambling to understand what was happening, but they had no answers. The final trial was the strategic conquest simulation, and it was the one challenge where Vethkai superiority should be absolutely undeniable. Long-term planning required patience and intelligence and the ability to think centuries ahead. Surely these short-lived creatures could not compete with minds that operated on 4 cognitive tracks and lived for 1,000 years. Surely the final trial would restore the natural order of things. Kethvaran kept telling himself this over and over, but somewhere deep inside he was beginning to wonder if everything he believed about the universe was wrong. The third and final trial was the strategic conquest simulation, and it was designed to test the long-term thinking capabilities of a species. Both sides would be dropped onto a simulated virgin world with identical starting conditions, and they would have 100 simulated years to build their civilizations. Victory would go to whichever side achieved dominance over the planet. High Arbiter Kethvaran was certain that this trial would finally prove Vethkai superiority, because strategic thinking required patience and foresight that short-lived species simply could not possess. His people lived for nearly 1,000 years, and their minds operated on 4 cognitive tracks simultaneously. They could plan centuries ahead while holding multiple contingencies in mind at all times. The human team was led by Dr. Aisha Patel, who was a historian specializing in the rise and fall of civilizations. She was 62 years old, with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes that had studied the ruins of countless empires. Her team consisted of economists and sociologists and military strategists who had spent their careers analyzing how civilizations succeeded and failed. The Vethkai team was led by Grand Strategist Mortekin, who had won this simulation 47 times against various species. His 4 cognitive tracks allowed him to manage economy and military and diplomacy and infrastructure simultaneously without any loss of efficiency. The simulation began with both sides controlling a small settlement on opposite sides of a resource-rich continent. The Vethkai immediately implemented their standard expansion protocol, which had been mathematically optimized over thousands of years. They built infrastructure at the perfect rate and expanded their borders at the perfect pace and managed their resources with perfect efficiency. By year 10, their civilization was a model of organized growth with every citizen in the right place and every resource allocated optimally. The human civilization was a mess. Dr. Patel had encouraged her team to experiment with different approaches, and the result was chaos. They overexpanded in the first decade, and 3 of their colonies collapsed due to resource shortages. A political faction emerged that disagreed with the central government and caused significant internal conflict. Their economy grew in fits and starts with boom periods, followed by painful corrections. The Vethkai observers watched this disaster unfold with amusement and contempt. They cannot even manage basic expansion, Grand Strategist Mortekin observed, and their civilization will collapse before year 50. But Dr. Patel was smiling as she watched her civilization struggle. Perfect, she said quietly. And now we learn. By year 20, the human civilization had stabilized after learning hard lessons from their early failures. The collapsed colonies had taught them exactly how to assess habitability before committing resources. The political conflict had resulted in a new governmental structure that was more flexible and representative. The economic corrections had led to regulations that prevented the worst kinds of speculation. They were still behind the Vethkai in every measurable metric, but they were growing stronger. By year 30, the gap had begun to narrow. The Vethkai civilization continued its perfect mathematical growth, but it was not accelerating because there was no need to change what was already optimal. The human civilization was innovating, constantly driven by the TUS memory of past failures and the fear of future ones. New technologies emerged from the pressure of necessity, and new social structures evolved from the experience of conflict. By year 50, the human civilization had caught up to the Vethkai in most areas and had surpassed them in several. Dr. Patel decided it was time to introduce some chaos. She sent diplomatic envoys to the Vethkai civilization offering trade agreements and cultural exchange programs. Grand Strategist Mortekin accepted because trade was mathematically beneficial for both sides. But the human traders brought more than goods with them. They brought ideas and stories and questions that the Vethkai had never considered. Why do you do things this way, and have you ever tried a different approach? And what if there was a better method? These questions spread through the Vethkai population, and for the first time in the simulation, their perfect consensus began to crack. By year 60, the Vethkai civilization was experiencing something it had never faced before: internal debate. Citizens were questioning the optimal protocols and suggesting alternatives that were not mathematically perfect, but might be more fulfilling. Grand Strategist Mortekin struggled to maintain control as his 4 cognitive tracks tried to process social dynamics that had never been part of his calculations. By year 75, the human civilization had clearly surpassed the Vethkai in every area. Their technology was more advanced because necessity had driven innovation. Their society was more resilient because they had survived multiple crises and learned from each one. Their military was more adaptable because they had trained for chaos rather than optimization. Then Dr. Patel introduced the final variable: a simulated pandemic. The disease spread rapidly through both civilizations, and the response revealed everything about their different approaches. The human civilization immediately began experimenting with treatments and quarantine protocols and vaccine development. They made mistakes and people died, but they learned from each error and adapted their response accordingly within a simulated decade. They had the pandemic under control, and their society was stronger for having survived it. The Vethkai civilization froze grand strategist Mortkaken's 4 cognitive tracks searched desperately for the optimal response, but there was no optimal response in their databases. They had never faced a pandemic before because their mathematically perfect society had prevented such events from ever occurring. When the optimal solution could not be found, they defaulted to their standard protocols, which were completely inadequate for this crisis. By year 90, the Vethkai civilization had been devastated by the pandemic, while the human civilization thrived. Dara Patel watched the final years of the simulation with a mixture of triumph and sadness. "You were too perfect," she said softly to the screen, showing the struggling Vethkai society. "And perfection is the most fragile thing in the universe." When the simulation ended at year 100, the Vethkai civilization existed only as a minor protectorate within the human sphere of influence. Grand strategist Mortkaken stared at the results in disbelief. "How?" he demanded. "And how did chaos defeat order? And how did failure lead to success?" Dr. Patel appeared on his screen with gentle eyes. "Because we learn from failure," she explained. "And every collapse in our history taught us something valuable about how to survive." She pulled up images of human history showing wars and plagues and famines and natural disasters. "We have faced extinction-level events over and over again, and each time we came back stronger because we remembered what had killed us." She looked at the grand strategist with something like compassion. "You have never failed because your mathematics protected you from failure, and so you never learned how to recover from disaster." She gestured at the simulation results. "We are not better than you at building civilizations, and we are better at rebuilding them after they fall apart." The final trial was complete, and humanity had won all 3 challenges. The Vethkai observers sat in stunned silence as they realized that everything they believed about strength and intelligence and superiority was wrong. The humans had proven that survival was not about being the best at anything. It was about refusing to stay down no matter how many times you were knocked over. The council chamber was completely silent as Commander Sarah Chun stood before the assembled representatives of 100 different species. She had walked into this room 1 month ago as the leader of a primitive species begging for recognition. Now she stood as the representative of the only species to ever defeat the Vethkai in the trial of supremacy. High Arbiter Kethvorin had not spoken since the final trial ended, and his 4 cognitive tracks were struggling to process what had happened. The apex species had been humiliated in front of the entire galaxy. They had lost the combat trial to a warrior who never threw a punch. They had lost the fleet trial to ships that fought without formations. They had lost the strategy trial to a civilization that grew stronger from failure. Everything the Vethkai believed about power and intelligence and superiority had been proven wrong. "How?" Kethvorin finally asked, and his voice echoed through the chamber. "And how did you defeat us?" Commander Chun looked up at the towering alien with calm eyes. "Because of everything you thought made us weak," she answered. She stepped forward and addressed not just the Arbiter, but the entire council. "You asked us to prove our worth, and you thought you were testing us against impossible challenges." She smiled softly. "But we have been tested every day of our existence for millions of years, and your trials were nothing compared to what our own planet has done to us." She gestured toward the window that showed the stars of the galaxy. "Every species here achieved greatness because the universe was kind to them, and they evolved on paradise worlds where survival was easy." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. You developed technology in peace and expanded into a gentle cosmos, and you became apex predators because nothing ever truly challenged you. She turned back to face Kethvorin directly. We became what we are because everything challenged us every single day, and our planet tried to kill us with predators and diseases and disasters and ice ages and meteor strikes. The other species in the chamber were listening intently now because they had never heard anyone speak to the Vethkai this way. We are not the strongest species in the galaxy, and we know this. Commander Chung continued. And we are not the fastest or the smartest or the longest lived. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. We are the most stubborn and the most adaptable and the most absolutely unreasonably unwilling to accept defeat. She looked around the chamber at the dozens of species who had spent millennia living in fear of the Vethkai. You called yourselves the apex species, but apex predators are specialists who dominate one environment until that environment changes. Her eyes returned to Kethvorin, and when the environment changes, they die because they never learned how to adapt. She took another step forward until she stood directly beneath the High Arbiter's throne. We are not apex predators because we are survivors, and we are the species that looked at every extinction event and every ice age and every mass famine and said not today. The chamber remained absolutely silent. Your warrior was stronger and faster than ours, Commander Chun acknowledged. But our warrior knew how to outlast an opponent because our ancestors survived by running prey to exhaustion. She continued her explanation. Your fleet tactics were mathematically perfect, but our crews knew how to think for themselves because we learned long ago that no plan survives contact with chaos. She gestured toward the holographic display that still showed the results of the final trial. Your strategists could plan centuries ahead, but our historians knew that civilizations grow strongest when they learn from failure, and you had never failed at anything. High Arbiter Kethvorin slowly descended from his throne until he stood face to face with the human commander. He towered over her by more than 3 feet, but somehow she did not seem small. You have proven your worth, he said quietly, and humanity has earned its place on the Galactic Council. Commander Chung nodded in acknowledgement, but she was not finished. With respect, High Arbiter, I think you misunderstand what has happened here today. Kethvorin tilted his head in confusion. We did not come here to beg for acceptance, Commander Chun explained, and we came here to show you something that you needed to see. She looked around at the assembled species one more time. Every civilization in this chamber has grown stagnant because you stopped being challenged, and you stopped growing because you stopped failing. Her voice filled with passion as she delivered her final message. We can teach you how to fail, and how to learn from failure, and how to grow stronger from every setback. She extended her hand toward the High Arbiter. You asked if we were worthy of joining your council, but the real question is whether you are ready to learn from us. Kethvorin stared at the offered hand for a long moment. In 11,000 years, no species had ever offered the Vethkai anything but submission and fear. This human was offering something far more valuable. She was offering the chance to grow. Slowly, the High Arbiter reached down and took the human commander's hand in his own massive grip. Perhaps, he said carefully, perhaps we have been the ones who needed to prove ourselves worthy. Commander Chun smiled warmly. That is the first step, and admitting that you have something to learn is always the hardest part. The chamber erupted in murmurs as the representatives processed what they had just witnessed. The Vethkai had ruled the galaxy through fear for 11,000 years, and now a species of soft, fragile, short-lived creatures had shown them a different path. 50 years later, the Galactic Council had a new name. They called it the Terran Alliance, and they called it this not because humanity had conquered anyone, but because humanity had taught them something precious. They had taught them that perfection was a prison, and that failure was a teacher. They had taught them that the greatest strength was not power or speed or intelligence. It was the simple, stubborn refusal to give up no matter how many times the universe knocked you down. High Arbiter Kethvorin retired to a small house on Earth because he wanted to spend his final centuries learning from the species that had changed everything. He sat in a garden one afternoon watching human children play a game that involved falling down and getting back up. Over and over again, Ambassador Chun, who had grown old by human standards, sat beside him in a comfortable chair. "I think I finally understand you," Kethvorin said quietly. "I understand why you smile so often." "Oh," the old woman asked, "and what do you understand?" "You know that something terrible could happen at any moment," Kethvorin replied, "and you are looking forward to surviving." Ambassador Chun laughed, and it was a warm sound full of joy and defiance. "Now you are getting it," she said, "and that is exactly what it means to be human." They sat together in the garden as the sun set over a world that had tried to kill its inhabitants for millions of years. And somehow those inhabitants had not only survived, they had thrived and spread across the stars and taught the galaxy that the measure of a species was not how rarely they fell. It was how many times they got back up the end.